Welcome and hello to everyone across all time zones to this webinar on transformative end-to-end innovation in a new era for climate and food. My name is Jana Körner. I'm the Innovation Manager of the CCAFS, which is a CGAR research program on climate change, agriculture, and food security. And I'm very happy to be setting the scene today, so welcome again. We need to urgently transform our food systems in the face of climate change and global crisis. This also means that we need to step up the scale and the pace of agricultural innovation. So to boost and to power this necessary step change, the UK government has launched the Sustainable Agriculture campaign as part of their COP26 presidency, of which the CCAFS and the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office co-chair the component of transforming agricultural innovation for people, nature and climate, with the following aims: to build consensus on evidence-based approaches, to showcase business models that work at the needed scale, gearing public investments towards end-to-end solution, and to mobilize new international commitments to bring research into use. Our webinar now is the fourth of a series that are based on evidence reviews, and together they outline the how to transform agricultural innovation. So I would like to give you a very quick summary of the first webinars. The first one revealed that of the 50 to 70 billion USD spent per year on agricultural innovation in the global south, only a small fraction goes into sustainable agriculture. And this is unacceptable and calls for action to increase, reorient and monitor funding towards sustainable agricultural intensification. The second webinar then looked at what to invest in with regard to agroecology and found the strongest evidence and impact for climate change adaptation and mitigation in diversification, agroforestry, and strengthening the local adaptive capacities through co-creation and knowledge sharing. The third webinar then emphasized on the importance of biodiversity as part of our food systems and directly interlinked with agriculture, food, and health. And we need to recognize that all parts of the system need to work together. And today now, we will look at how can we work together. Are our institutions fit for purpose to deliver innovations at scale? What is end-to-end innovation? Why do we need that? And what needs to be done? And before I stop here, I would like to encourage all of you, while you listen, think of your own organization or your role in innovation and share your thoughts and questions in the Q&A box. And with that, I would like to hand over to our moderator of the day, the director of CCAFS, Bruce Campbell. Welcome, Bruce.
Thanks, Jana. Welcome, everybody. So today the topic is end-to-end innovation. Jana's given us some ideas why this is necessary. So we've got these real mega challenges ahead. And innovation is a crucial part of meeting those challenges. Why is innovation a crucial part of it? I can give you one example. So a group of scientists got together, estimated what we need to do in terms of greenhouse gas emission reduction in the agriculture and food sector. And they also estimated that with our current technologies, we can only reach about 40%, maximum 40% of the target. So there's a huge amount of innovation needed in order to meet the greenhouse gas targets, let alone discussing adaptation targets, etc., etc. So agricultural research for development cannot be business as usual. We really have to become more farmer-centric. We have to think about how we can rapidly innovate to meet the needs of society, not so much the needs of the research community where the emphasis is on publication. We need products and outputs, policies, technologies that are taken up by society. And so that's why we're putting a big emphasis on thinking about end-to-end innovation. So what is end-to-end innovation? Well, to answer that question, we've been working with Akshay Duda, and he's an independent consultant. And interestingly, he's also got experience in the health sector. So I think it's really important because we've seen how rapid innovations can happen within the health sector. Akshay has worked with the Gates Foundation, for example, where he's worked on their multi-billion-dollar strategies related to malaria, agriculture, and advocacy. So I'm going to hand over now to Akshay to take us through understanding what is end-to-end innovation and how do we support it and make it happen. Over to you, Akshay.
Thank you so much, Bruce, and thank you so much, Jana. As both Jana and Bruce have mentioned, this is a pivotal time for agriculture and agricultural research. The gains to both food security and nutrition we have made in the past decade have slowed down considerably since 2011, and greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture continue to steadily rise. As we all are aware, COVID-19 in the past 16 months has wreaked further havoc on food prices, food security, and supply chains. In this backdrop, it has become imperative to identify not just new sources of funding, but also new approaches. Today's webinar and the presentation that I'm going to walk you through helps us try and understand what these new approaches might look like. Before we start talking about the new approaches, I want to walk us through a review of some of the barriers that we identified to agricultural research today. And while there are manifold barriers to agricultural research, there are certain systemic and persistent barriers today that hold back innovations, particularly in the ag system. So I'll walk you through the four on the screen. The first, and Bruce mentioned this a little bit earlier, is that research organizations today do not have a culture of impact and focus on the individual incentives of the research community rather than those of the end users. And those can be very, very different, therefore leading to a stifling of innovation. Secondly, monitoring and evaluation plans are often not appropriately set up to measure what we call end stage impact. And the idea here is that they are very process-oriented, measuring incremental changes or ability to match processes, but not actually if the work is having an impact at the end user level. Thirdly, current funding and institutional mechanisms often do not encourage or support trial and error, particularly at early stages of research. And again, this is critical when we start to think about innovation, which sort of by definition is taking a step into the unknown and involves a lot of trial and error. And finally, and certainly not leastly, bridging mechanisms or boundary institutions, as we often call them, that allow for free-flowing exchange of information are underfunded and often underutilized. And these sort of might seem like they're fairly straightforward problems to solve, but as we discuss further, they are often systemic and require a complete rethink of how we approach innovation. And that sort of serves as the foundation of advocating for what we call end-to-end approaches or E2E approaches. So when we say end-to-end approaches, what is it that we exactly mean? Well, in this case, we're going to focus on 4 specific points of definition that help us understand and better define end-to-end innovation. We start with the idea that end-to-end innovation works across the innovation system for agriculture. And in the bottom left of the slide here, you'll see what we mean by sort of the entire innovation system for agriculture. What we have on this slide is a sort of simplified version of the same. The idea being that the ag innovation system is an iterative and a sort of loopy innovation system that goes through multiple different steps, starting from and ending with the user. The second element of end-to-end innovation is that research efforts are targeted towards end user needs specifically, and these can be varied and different in different settings, but always the end user needs come first. Number 3, they are underpinned by robust partnerships with private, public, and civil society actors, and I cannot emphasize how critical it is, particularly as we review evidence from different fields, to identify channels and mechanisms to bring together private, public, and civil society actors. And fourthly, and perhaps most importantly, they ensure adoption and societal outcomes at scale. Like I mentioned a little bit earlier, at the bottom of the slide, we have a simplified version or a vision of how innovation takes place through upstream, transition, and downstream steps. The idea is innovation isn't a straightforward, isn't a linear process. It is iterative, messy, and loopy. But it is important to keep this in the back of your mind as you start to think about how you can take the current innovation process you have in your respective organizations and convert it or transform it into something that meets the definition of end-to-end that we put out here. Having conducted a broad review of academic literature, industry literature, and interviews with experts, what we did then is we have identified 8 steps that we think are critical to taking the status quo as we see it today when it comes to innovation and agricultural research for innovation and transforming it to what we call end-to-end innovation. In the next 5 minutes or so, I'm going to walk you through those 8 steps. And the idea here is that underlying each of these 8 steps are a set of unique best practices that specifically target levers or pivot points where we think you can have an outsized impact by making change. We start with what we call creating room for innovation. And the idea here is to create an environment or an atmosphere in which individuals, communities feel encouraged to innovate. And this includes both approaches that deal with the culture of innovation and creating an environment where people are feeling comfortable, as well as physical changes to spaces and organizational changes that encourage what we call open communication and collaboration, for example. The second step then talks about the importance of developing specific channels that allow for exchanges of ideas and broaden perspectives. And again, here, there are 2 levels at which we are encouraging this happens. One is within an organization between different groups or domains, and 2 is across organizations. And this becomes extremely important and often has, as we mentioned here, both a technological perspective, which involves creating tools for supporting knowledge sharing, as well as often a policy perspective that deregulates the transmission of ideas and knowledge across borders. Step number 3 involves developing the organizational ability to test, learn, and iterate. As we had mentioned in the barriers, one of the persistent issues is organizations feeling uncomfortable and individuals within an organization feeling uncomfortable failing or creating problems or projects that don't come up with success. And we need to find a way to change that culture. And while this can't be persistent everywhere, there are certain things we can do, particularly around how we create stage gates at the early stage of a process and how we redesign both financial and organizational incentives to encourage this rapid iteration, failing, and most critically, learning from failures. Step 4 talks about improvements to our approaches to scale. And the big takeaway here is that we must prepare for scale from the get-go. And there are many things that we can do to sort of support that. Most critically, developing partnerships with experts who know how to develop products and services at scale at an early stage. Developing dedicated touch points to engaging with end users in scaling. And perhaps most critically, when working with the private sector and other actors, utilizing new financing mechanisms, and particularly pull-based financing mechanisms that ensure that these actors have skin in the game. Having walked through sort of the first half of the innovation value chain, dealing with the upstream steps, we now start talking a little bit about the downstream side. And we have 3 to 4 recommendations here. The first deals with the idea of innovating on process and not just product. And the idea here is that while when we think of innovation, we often think of what we can call disruptive innovation or transformative innovation, the routine year-on-year incremental innovation process is often just as effective and important, particularly in the field of agriculture. And there are ways that we must change our organization to continue to create emphasis on that and encourage the creation of communities of practice and platforms that enable this continuous innovation process. Number 6 talks about aligning incentives between the end user, in this case, the smallholder farmer, and all the other organizations involved in the innovation system. And there are a variety of ways in which you can do this, but we believe a few critical ones here are creating updates to innovation goals that align financial and organizational incentives for individuals with these innovation goals, and investing in new metrics and benchmarks for the quality of the innovation process itself that then allow us to set better and stronger goals for individuals. Number 7 talks about the enabling environment, which is a broad term for both policies, cultures, and norms, and talks about the kinds of approaches we must take to create long-term stability in the enabling environment. The 2 big takeaways here is the importance of building out innovation ecosystems around institutions, particularly academic institutions, capable of supplying strong human capital and the technical skills required to create innovation in the local environments where we want to scale these innovations up. The second talks about how we must understand better the different types of policy tools available to us and marry those policy tools with the right goals to create an inclusive and stable environment. Finally, and certainly not leastly, we talk about the importance of determining and designing a change process suited to an ecosystem's capacity to change. The idea here is that the 7 previous concepts or steps all talk about the different things one must do to change one's environment. But the change process itself is often difficult, and many good ideas and many good change initiatives fail because the process itself has not been designed appropriately. And there are certain few things we must do very well to make sure that regardless of our organizational context, we can actually create an environment where we can move towards more end-to-end innovation. The idea here is to make sure that stakeholders are bought in, communication between the initiators of the change and those being affected by it is clear and continuous. And perhaps most importantly, we identify and empower the right type of leader, leaders who can embrace and champion change and who understand and live out the values of end-to-end innovation. I'm going to stop there and hand it back. Thank you very much.
Fantastic, actually, great. So we go to a panel now to answer a few questions and take us a bit deeper into the subject. We have 3 persons. It's Charlotte Watts. She's the Chief Scientific Advisor, Head of Research and Evidence at the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, FCDO. She's also seconded from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, where she's a professor. So it's also interesting to get a health perspective on the matter. Then we have Dada Bakuda. She's a senior consultant and expert on climate policy and finance, land use and climate smart agriculture, working a lot with ASEAN. It'd be really interesting to get some feel of things on the ground so that we can make sure that we're grounded in this. And we have with us Anand Patwadan, who's a professor of public policy at the Center of Global Sustainability, University of Maryland. I got to know Anand very well through the Global Commission on Adaptation, so it's great to have you here as well, Anand. I'll start with a question to Charlotte and exploring the connection to the health sector. Based on Akshay's presentation and drawing on your own experience in supporting rapid innovation in the health sector, what do you see as the key barriers to developing end-to-end innovation models at scale? Go ahead, Charlotte.
Great, thanks. And real pleasure to be here, and really nice presentation. I could identify quite a lot with the points being made in the presentation. I must say I was sort of sitting here off screen nodding my head. And I think the real barrier, the big issue is just the complexity of the challenges that we face. And be that if I think about responding to climate change or the impacts of biodiversity loss. These are really challenging area, and the solutions are going to be complex too. And sort of fundamentally, what we need to enable is a join up, both in the R&D side of learning, both not only on next generation technologies, but also how we get those used, how they feed into decision making, how new evidence feeds into decision making. And when you're looking at these complex issues in particular, there's just so many different actors at different levels and with different perspectives, but all with a really important role to play. And I mean, I come from an academic background where I've brought together a range of expertise, be it economics, behavioral science, epidemiological, And actually, even just having conversations in a joined up way across disciplines isn't necessarily simple, and it takes effort and investment to really, to tap into the richness of insights that you can get from working in that multidisciplinary way, but it's not easy. And that's on a small scale. If you think about that across a major problem, it does take time and effort and commitment of all of those involved. I think an important element that I've learned from my own research in global health is the importance of the sort of behavioral and social science insights, and that includes economics as part of that. If I look back on sort of some of the histories of investment in health technologies, sort of a decade or so ago or more ago, often the focus would be on the technology, and the behavioral and sort of potential future use applications would be a sort of secondary element and come much later on. And there would be these at times quite naive assumptions about, well, if you get the right thing, it's somehow going to magically get out and be used at scale. And we know it's not like that. There are political dimensions, there are financial dimensions. Their core elements are just about what do people want, what motivates them, what actually would meet their needs and their priorities. I think across many areas, we're getting more sophisticated in understanding that. And if I look at, most recently the lessons from COVID, we haven't always got it right, but I am seeing much more explicitly that the sort of behavioral social science components are feeding in alongside more scientific and other technical assessments. And in some respects, that has very much sped up our ability to really try and go from a promising innovation through to taking that at scale. There are clearly much more work to do on across these areas, but I think we are learning, and we need to continue to learn. And then lastly, just in terms of thinking about the role of donors, clearly we have a really important role to play, and in sort of trying to understand the ecosystems, trying to engage with key stakeholders, to listen and try and ensure in our own funding that we try and create the right incentives for some of the different key actors that might be engaged with and working on different aspects of moving forward on a complex problem, actually working together and achieving that join up, and that we're giving the right incentives to encourage that in the way that we support the partners that we work with. Thanks.
That's great. I think we could have a fantastic conversation around the technology focus of innovation, because we see it in the ag sector as well, where it's so dominated by sort of technology focus, and the political and social behavioral pieces are forgotten. Dada, you work with people on the ground. From your perspective, what level of investment would be needed to deliver end-to-end innovation at scale? We're really interested in the scale because of the challenges ahead. Go ahead.
Hi, Bruce. Thanks for the question. And after listening to Akshay and bringing it in within the context of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, I take a deep breath and I think, oh, is this going to be impossible? It seems a very ambitious investment level is needed for. When you look at ASEAN, also the context of it, 10 member countries, 300 working groups, interministerial, high-level meetings of different sectors and ministers. You begin to be overwhelmed and say, where's the investment gonna come from? But let's break it down at the initial traditional level of investments. We can look at pilots on the ground. We can look at traditional investments ways where you see the business case and then you get more empowered and you get private sector financing as well. And then there's always what we get from traditional financing, grants from the GCF, from IFAD as well on innovation, and World Bank, and all these agencies that can give us funds as well as public-private partnerships. But I like Akshay's presentation in a way that it allowed me to really reflect on unseen, untangible, unmeasurable results that we need, or action points that we need in order to bring us to this whole change process. And I think I have a few suggestions with the few minutes that I given to me. One of these is that I think we really need, especially in Southeast Asia, where there's a lot of diploma meals. I think what we need is really an investment in education in a way that allows people to think, learn from trial and error, think very openly and collaboratively. That's one very long-term investment that I think we need if we're looking at innovation. And then the second one is I think we need an investment in communication. I take this after listening to the super vet, who is now my hero, Dr. Noel Fitzpatrick. Here's a guy who's 3D printing bionic arms and legs to cats and dogs. And it's very cutting edge innovation. And he realized that he could only do end-to-end innovation and change the world if he goes on television and show the science. But then he realized that that's not enough. What people wanted to see is love. And how do you capture, and this is coming from dog love first, how do you capture love in 1 minute or 30 seconds? And he showed it by the science behind just a pet owner wanting to save his dog in that moment in time. But there's the big science of the bionic arms and the 3D printing behind it. And he said he realized after this long journey that in order to change the world, you really need to learn to communicate. And so I think drawing from this, we should also invest in making our scientists be able to communicate. Just a little suggestion for that. And I think we also need what we often don't see. We create a whole holistic framework. We've come up with food system framework, etc. Very holistic that calls for interministerial coordination, intersectoral collaboration. But we have sometimes forgotten that unless you invest in the whole inter-bureaucratic infrastructure of who's going to coordinate this, it might not happen. And that's an absent investment that we need at the moment, because we can keep creating very holistic end-to-end frameworks, but if there's no backing of the infrastructure of how we're going to make people talk to one another and get them out of the silos, the bureaucracy behind it, and even the communities that are very much entrenched in their silos, it might not happen. So that's the kind of investments and realities I hope that we can see and focus on in the future.
Great, thanks, Dada. So you started talking about how we all talk together and collaborate, and I want to perhaps ask Anand if something to follow up on that. So what type of collaboration along the innovation system do you think is most useful to ensure research provides concrete response to local needs and challenges? Where do we start with the collaboration issue?
Thanks, Bruce, and great to be here. Really learned a lot from some very interesting presentations from Akshay and the previous speakers. Couple of thoughts. The first is, I guess the question of collaboration needs to be set in the context of what is our vision of the innovation system. And I think there are actually different visions. You can have a vision of innovation system that's rooted in formal science, and you then are trying to figure out essentially how to get that science connected to user needs. There's also a vision of the innovation system which comes from grassroots innovation, where actually the source and of the solution and the user of the solution are actually the same entity. So you might very well have the innovator be a smallholder farmer, a user who we call a user. So I think kind of that's the first aspect to keep in mind as to what is what kind of an innovation system are we looking at. The second, I guess, aspect is, Akshay presented a really nice view of how the innovation process. One way of thinking about the innovation process is in terms of the actors in that process. And there's at least 4 different types of actors. Sometimes they overlap, sometimes they don't. You have the scientists, who are often motivated much more, as has been said by others, by the pure pursuit of knowledge, so the curiosity-driven research. You have innovators who are motivated much more by the application question. You have entrepreneurs, and it's interesting, I didn't hear the word entrepreneur mentioned as yet, but entrepreneurs are critical intermediary in actually getting innovations to market. Here's an actor whose motivation is much more the commercialization and the commercial success. And of course, you have users, and again, these types of actors are not exclusive. You could very well have users being entrepreneurs themselves. They could well be innovators themselves. But in terms of the nature of actors, and they have different motivations. A scientist is often not a very good innovator or even an entrepreneur. But then you need a way to connect. So this is where I guess the notion of collaboration becomes so important, is you need to be able to bring together rather dissimilar actors, both in terms of their motivations, but also in terms of their interests and capabilities. I think that is one of the functions that a effective innovation system needs to be able to deliver, is how do we connect these actors together? So in other domains, whether it's through incubation, whether it is through co-creation spaces, whether it is through other means of connecting these very different types of actors. And then, as Charlotte mentioned, even within science, there is kind of the whole spread of which science disciplines are most important. And we have often seen that collaboration within science is also hard. Especially when it comes to transdisciplinary efforts or efforts that connect social, natural, and social sciences together. So that's kind of where I wanted to set in terms of the nature of collaborations and the actors who need to collaborate. Thanks, Bruce.
Okay, that's great. I'm going to go straight into questions that are coming in from the audience, as we have quite a large number of them. Perhaps I start with Charlotte. Charlotte, what do you see as the first steps needed to support end-to-end innovation in agricultural research? Based on the recommendations we've kind of heard from Akshay.
Yeah, I mean, a few things come to mind. I think actually just sort of picking up the point I made before about, really that need to try and build organizational incentives for rapid innovation. I think we need to really try and get the balance of risk right. If we're really talking about innovation, it means that we're encouraging organizations to take risk. And yet, historically, organizations can be quite risk averse. And again, some of our incentives are that they are risk averse. We need to get much faster at exploring a range of options and just stopping quickly and closing down areas that are unlikely to yield results. It's that, aim high and fail quickly type strategy. It's looking at a portfolio of innovations, but really sort of recognizing that actually we need R&D to take that risk. And I think COVID has shown us actually that when we have the will, we can act and speed up timelines that historically have been very slow. I think the question for us is then, how do you bring that same sense of urgency to the pressing issues of climate change or biodiversity loss? I think, a key element is that we need to be having a new paradigm where we really push on making that test, review, revise, and retest happen in far quicker cycles. I think the second element that I've believed for some time, but again, it's getting more focused, I think, increasingly, is just the importance of that translational research. And, the value of organizations that can translate and try and test how do you take things out to scale. And I completely agree with the previous speaker about the role of innovators as part of that. And I mean, I think the report is interesting in terms of, highlighting that as a recommendation. And I think it's interesting also of, the kind of characteristics that they highlight about the types of organizations that are able to do this. To me, there's still a bit of a question of how much can existing organizations adapt to be that flexible translational work, to support that translational work, or is it that we have to invest and grow other types of innovative organizations that can really feed into that space, because it really is incredibly important, and it's one that I think we need to put more investment in. And then lastly, I think there probably are areas around funding as well, and just how do we stage gate funding. And actually, it's one of the areas we try and look at across our research investments, is how do we learn about the types of follow-up funding and in R&D investments at risk that we can put in to try and support not only early stage potentially developments, but also in that later stage of testing approaches to taking things to scale, to that test and learn and fail type circle. Because I think clearly having the financial resource behind some of these translational organizations is going to be a critical part to taking effective innovations to scale.
Oh, that's great. I love all the wording around taking risks and testing and learning and fail quickly and those sorts of things. Really interesting. Actually, you mentioned funding models that bring different parties together. Do you have examples of those?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think, as Charlotte had just mentioned, there are examples, particularly within the health space, that have tried to create funding mechanisms and models that require collaboration. So, for instance, there's funding from a set of organizations, particularly philanthropic organizations, around vaccine development, where the funding for each stage of the vaccine development process requires for there to be collaboration between the research organization, which often comes up with the original technology, and the scaling organization. And the sort of innovation there in terms of how the funding is organized is how you split out the reward funding, right? So there's a section in our report that talks a little bit about pull-based mechanisms and goes into a little bit of the detail about how you set up prizes or reward-based funding that create this sort of pull and forces collaboration between different elements of the innovation ecosystem, because they are good at slightly different things. But you need to get them to start working together. And what the prize does is that it facilitates that sort of really critical step of creating an agreement and creating a mechanism through which technology can be transferred fairly from one institution to another. So the health space has a few of these good examples, and we mentioned them in the report a little bit, but that's a good example of creating prizes where there is a collaboration between different parties that take on different parts of the innovation itself.
Great, thanks. Perhaps you could try this one. I think it comes from Marielle Karsenberg, the Netherlands Food Partnership. How do you ensure the end users of the innovations have ownership of the innovation process? And how to ensure more engagement occurs with social scientists in innovation processes? Is that something for you, Dana?
Yeah, sure. I think that is very important. When I think one tool is that the utilization of multi-stakeholder platforms from the beginning. Our experience, for example, here with the ASEAN Climate Resilience Network has been really, we were reporting to the intergovernmental organization. And so there's a lot of very official decisions that need to be transported into that channel. But then as a network, we wanted to maintain more flexibility rather than what's being imposed on us. And by flexibility, we wanted more open door meetings and really having an ownership of any project or an initiative or an innovation, because without it, there's no one that's actually going to push it through across several sectors. And you need a very strong champion in order to push an innovation through, especially if you're going to cut across so many science and technology ministries, Ministry of Environment for climate change issues, ministries of agriculture and forestry, even health. You're gonna have to cut across this, and you need a very strong champion. And a strong champion, of course, comes from ownership, and ownership comes from who are really the end user of this, who is it for. So I think multi-stakeholder dialogue platforms, multi-stakeholder platforms are ensure that there is ownership and participation and engagement, and that you don't lose track of who is it for. You don't lose track within the politics of, let's say, policy negotiation, funding issues, even the design and development of it. So it's multi-stakeholders, such as our experience with the ASEAN Climate Resilience Network, that's also willing to break down the rules being imposed by an intergovernmental organization, of such as closing doors on meetings, because then that's not friendly to innovation.
Okay, good. So just a reminder, everybody, keep your questions rolling in. I'm getting them fed by one of my colleagues. We've got a few still, but we can get some more. Anand, perhaps for you, how can we best move towards integrated institutional frameworks, which appear as key to deliver innovation at scale?
Thanks, Bruce. So I guess the starting point to answer that is maybe to think about what does it mean to have innovations at scale? Are we looking at taking an innovation to scale, which is often the case where we have a new product or a technology that needs to be replicated or kind of needs to be scaled up? But the other way of looking at it is, can we have an innovation system that actually can deliver results at scale? And what that means is that the space of solutions may be actually quite heterogeneous. So there may be, so for example, in adaptation, we talk about locally led adaptation. We talk about adaptation that is, that actually happens in an extremely distributed and often heterogeneous manner. So you might need. So I guess that's kind of the one thing to keep in mind is when we think about scale, are we thinking about scale simply as in terms of replicating a particular innovation, whether it's a systems, product, process, technology, or we are thinking of a system that can also support heterogeneity and variety, noting that there is huge contextual differences. There's especially if you look at kind of within the agriculture domain. There is variety. There is also in terms of technologies. There's also variety in terms of needs. So you kind of have the challenge that you need to deliver at scale across a very heterogeneous landscape, both in terms of problems but also in terms of solutions. So what that means from an institutional perspective is you actually need one of the things that Akshay talked about was the enabling environment. You need an enabling environment that can actually support that heterogeneity and variety, rather than an environment that simply says, okay, we know the answer, and it's simply a matter of now everyone adopting that answer. So I think when you move away from the notion that this is just somehow an adoption and diffusion process that has to be accelerated, to thinking that this is a process where you need to simultaneously, effectively let 1,000 flowers bloom. That's a very different model for an integration in an institutional environment that can support it. And what that means is beyond then the enabling environment is also the kind of institutional support, whether it is through extension services, whether it is through platforms that actually connect users and developers together in a way that is, provides equal opportunity for them to engage. So I think those are some of the implications for creating a innovation system that can actually support this challenge of delivering at scale, and not necessarily one solution, but actually a multiplicity of solutions that are actually emerging from these different contexts. Back to you.
Great. So perhaps this is a follow-up question from a previous one where we talked about the engagement of end users. What is the role and importance in the use of local languages for communication? And do we do it enough as part of our innovation process? I don't know who wants to chip in on that one.
I would just like to agree. If you think about actually getting products out to the people that need it most, you really have to be thinking about what are all the aspects that facilitate that, and clearly getting materials out in local languages, getting out information to communities that might not be literate. These are all important aspects to consider. And again, it's some of those areas that might not receive attention in our thinking about translation, but clearly could be a critical barrier to future access and scale. And it's interesting, when I talk to some of the tech companies who are having digital solutions, that's actually one of the areas that I see highlighted as a challenge that they're seeking how to address, is how do you actually have the capability to translate in relevant and accessible ways materials, and particularly for contexts where there might be multiple languages that you're trying to interact with.
And maybe just to build on what Charlotte said, so in a way, I think it calls for a democratization of the innovation process, right? So sort of saying, okay, you're not sitting somewhere and now conveying to users, but it's really understanding that when you start engaging with communities in their languages, you are actually bringing them in as equal partners. That it's kind of not this one-way notion, but there is actually things that they can provide, which might be quite critical, in fact, to have success. Because at the end of the day, innovations are successful or only if they're going to be used. Unlike those of us, as an academic, I'm perfectly happy with having a paper in a journal, but as an innovator, I think I would really want to make sure that there is uptake in use.
And I'm just going to come in there very quickly, because I think both Anand and Charlotte make a really important point, which is in the private sector, there's a whole body of growing work in the service literature that talks about this idea of in the private sector, it's a question of how do you best spend your R&D dollars, and there's a way of saying I'm going to take this burden of innovating and sort of put it on the end user, because it's a mutually reinforcing and beneficial cycle, where for me, the cost of collecting that information and then translating it and then understanding it as somebody who doesn't have the context is really difficult. But when I create a mechanism where I allow and I enable those who are actually using the innovation or the product or the service to help me understand how to improve it, makes it better for both of us. And that's sort of a very undervalued concept to apply, even though I think it's more applicable in development and in agriculture than it often is in sort of private sector services. So I think thinking about or reimagining what it means to innovate and how you treat the end user in the innovation system is a really important process. And there's a cultural piece to it. There's probably an organizational piece to it, which we talk about a little bit, but again, can't emphasize this enough.
And just to say, I come from doing work on HIV and sexual health and violence, and the idea that you would try and innovate without engaging with the communities and understanding the realities they're facing and really working in partnership, just, you would never expect to get very far. And, I think there are some important lessons to be learned to agriculture and some of the other sectors.
So perhaps, so we've talked quite a lot about the end user in terms of the in our context, it's the farmers, a lot of the farmers and the small and medium enterprises, perhaps. What about the private sector? There was another question about the private sector. What is the role of the private sector in the agricultural space, in the innovation part? And perhaps we could have some quick closing comments from all panelists on that one. Perhaps I can see you, Anand, on the screens, so you go first.
Thanks, Bruce. So, one of the entities I mentioned earlier was the entrepreneur, and that's actually a very critical. So when I think about the private sector, I'm thinking about that in multiple ways, right? So it's not just as a intermediary to bring a solution or a technology to market, but it's also as a source of the innovation. And I think in any innovation system, that entity is pretty critical. I guess one of the differences might be is even within agriculture, you've got quite a diversity of settings. I mean, you can think of smallholder farmers for whom the private sector has a very different picture than large, commercial farming operations, where again it's a very different model. But regardless of that, I think the private sector is obviously central in any innovation system, because that's the entity that's typically going to be, taking innovations to market. And there, I think the potential for linking this to other social objectives, whether it has to do with employment or economic growth, really becomes quite critical. So I see that as not just then benefiting the agriculture sector, but it's really then serving a larger economic purpose. Thanks.
Dada, do you want to add on the private sector?
Yeah, well, I'm just reflecting on this little black soldier fly farm that we have in the Philippines, in a very small island. And it was first started by an innovator who is one of the inventor of the USB, for example. But his farm grew because there was a big resort and hotel that gave him the food waste for the black soldier flies to eat. And so without that cooperation with the private sector, as Anand mentioned, there wouldn't be. But these are like tiny pilots, and we need to connect. We need to connect these best practices that where an innovator and the private sector help one another. And we need to connect it to the bigger picture of policy frameworks that will allow most of them to have more support. So there is this role from the very small community level to even big companies like Shell clamoring for policy reform to mitigate the risk of their investments. So from community level to big scale policy framework support, the private sector does have a role. And we hope that this example from Shell Philippines, we hope that they will really be able to, they are actually behind the changing of some of the policies as requested by them to mitigate the risk of their investments.
Charlotte, would you like to add something on the private sector as well?
I mean, just to say, clearly, private sector is very central and is an important source of innovation. When I think about the agricultural sector, to me, what strikes me is just the diversity of what we might be talking about when we're thinking about the private sector, be it a small scale farmer through to some sort of intermediates, be it on food processing or selling particular commodities you might need to use for agriculture, through to larger scale corporations. I think as we think about the opportunities around innovation, I'm particularly concerned that we think about innovations that meet the needs of poorer farmers and also in bringing women who are an important section of the agricultural food producers who at times can be left out of innovation processes. And that we think about in that role, how do we create new growth opportunities and new business opportunities all the way up that pipeline of different players. And again, think about how do we get and invest in innovations that make it more effective, that some of the opportunities from some of the big players actually, and some of the demand potentially from big players actually creates new opportunities for poorer innovators in this system. And so getting that join up across that sort of socioeconomic element is just one of the areas that we try and think about.
Great, thanks. Actually, you started, and I want to give you 1 second to respond to this question. Somebody says that the 8 principles or recommendations are really very helpful. To what extent do they apply in other sectors? And I'm sure you can do that very quickly.
I mean, I think the short answer is hopefully largely they do. The goal was to try and take as holistic a point of view on innovation, and I think if you sort of dive deep into the report, you'll sort of see them specifically applied to the agricultural context. But the goal of the report, of the interviews and the literature, was to be as broad as possible and not domain specific. So hopefully, as long as they resonate, and to the conversation we've been having, the critical thing is to apply them and adapt them to everybody's individual context. And I think as long as folks are doing that and thinking proactively about what this means in their system, hopefully they should be applicable everywhere.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot. So thanks very much to the panelists and for the report that you produced. I'm going to hand over to Alan Tollovy, who's the Senior Lively Advisor at FCDO, and he will close today and introduce the next seminar. Go ahead, Alan.
Yeah, thanks, Bruce. I can close, but I'm not sure I can introduce the next seminar. Somebody can take that on. Thanks very much. Thanks to panelists, and thanks to Akshay and Jana and Danush who worked on this report with us, with me. When we commissioned this study with CCAFs several months ago, I think one of the last question there was, to actually was, to what extent does this pull in lessons from other sectors, or are these lessons relevant to other sectors? I think we really wanted to bring Akshay in because he can bring that experience from other sectors. He can take a view that isn't rooted in the sort of discussions which can be quite introverted in agriculture and food. I remember one of the first discussions I ever had with Chris Whitty when he was the chief scientist in FCDO, or DFID in those days. Somebody said, Chris, it's very easy in the health sector. Agriculture is much more complex than health. And he said, the reason you think that is because you don't understand the health sector. And I think that there is an element in which agriculture always likes to think its problems are much more complicated than other people's. So if we brought some of that thinking into agriculture that's been drawn out of hard lessons learned in other sectors, I think we've achieved something. The 2 things I take from this, firstly, are, Akshay's point that we should innovate on process. I thought that was a really key point. It's not really about thinking about how we innovate on products, although there's clearly a role for that. It's thinking about institutions can evolve and act in a different way. And I think, hopefully, we've pulled out some key lessons about that. We took a very explicit institutional organizational perspective on this. And we did that because, to me and to the others working on this, it was very much thinking about how the various actors work together that is a key element of how we can make this system work better. The other point I took was Charlotte's question, which I thought was highly relevant and one we've asked ourselves, I think, from time to time, is, are the current institutions we have the right institutions? I mean, are they so set in their ways that we can never move them? Do we need to think about different ways of bringing people together? I say that, quite consciously from my work with the CGIAR and the efforts to try and shift the CG from a research-based organization to an innovation-based organization. That's a difficult. Those are deep-rooted cultural shifts you're trying to bring about. Now, I'm not saying we should throw everything up in the air and start again. Absolutely not. But I do think we need to ask really hard questions about the institutions we currently have and ask if they're, firstly, the right institutions, and secondly, whether they're innovative and creative enough in the way that they work together. And thirdly, the last point, which I think everybody's emphasized, is it begins and starts with the end users. Organizations need to start off by assessing demand. They need to continue to work with end users through the process, and they need to ultimately The success metrics, the way in which institutions will change, is if we judge their success solely by the impact they have with the people that we're trying to help. And if we don't do that, then we allow institutions to continue to operate in a way that serves their own needs rather than the needs of other people. So those are my 3 take-homes, and there's a really important points, and hopefully through this study we've got some insights as to how we might begin to bring about some of that transformation. Thanks, and whoever's going to introduce the next session, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Alan. And Danish has actually sent the next session in the chat box to everybody. And it's what level of investment is needed for transforming agricultural systems in the Global South on the 23rd of June. And there's a link also in the chat box. So thanks everybody for today. Thanks to the panelists and Akshay.
Thank you, Bruce, for moderating.
Bye.
Thanks.